close your eyes. Imagine the wind, the struggle, the first moment a machine lifted into the sky. Two brothers, a dream, and a world that refused to believe. Will they succeed? Stay with me until the end and witness history take flight. Chapter 1. The Dream Takes Flight. The house was quiet that evening. A warm glow from the oil lamps flickered on the walls. Milton Wright, the boy's father, sat in his chair, a small box in his hands. Wilbur and Orville, still young, watched him with eager eyes. Their father smiled. "I have something for you," he said. He opened the box and took out a small toy. It was made of wood, with a thin rubber band wrapped around the middle. The boys leaned in closer. "It's a flying machine," Milton said. Wilbur, the older of the two, reached out first. He ran his fingers over the smooth surface, curiosity shining in his eyes. Orville, younger and more restless, could barely hold back his excitement. Their father twisted the rubber band tight, then let go. The toy shot up into the air. It spun, floated, and then slowly drifted down. The boys gasped. It was like magic. A machine. That could fly. Orville grabbed it next. "Let me try," he laughed. He twisted the rubber band even more and launched it again. The little toy flew higher this time, reaching the ceiling before falling gently back into his hands. Wilbur's eyes followed it. His mind was racing. "How does it work?" he wondered aloud. Milton chuckled. "It's called a helicopter," he explained. "The French made it. It flies because of the way the blades move through the air." The boys didn't hear him anymore. Their minds were already far away, somewhere up in the clouds, imagining a world where people could fly like birds. From that day on, the little toy was their most prized possession. They flew it again and again, watching how it moved, trying to understand its secret. But one day, disaster struck. Orville wound the rubber band too tight. He released the toy, and it flew straight into the fireplace. Flames swallowed it instantly. The boys froze. Their beloved flying machine gone. Orville's eyes filled with tears. "It's ruined," he whispered. Wilbur said nothing, staring at the fire. Then, after a long moment, he turned to his brother. "We'll make another one," he said. Their father smiled quietly from his chair. That was how it began. The Wright brothers grew up in a house filled with books, ideas, and dreams. Their father was a bishop, a man of strong beliefs and big thoughts. Their mother, Susan, was quiet but clever. She built toys for them, fixed things around the house, and encouraged their curiosity. The boys were always inventing something. They built kites, crafted their own tools, and spent hours outside watching birds soar through the sky. Wilbur was thoughtful, always deep in thought. He read every book he could find. Orville was energetic, always moving, always searching for something new. Together, they made the perfect team. One summer, they built a giant kite. Wilbur held it high, feeling the wind rush past his fingers. Orville pulled the string tight. "Ready?" Wilbur asked. Orville nodded. Wilbur let go. The kite shot into the sky, dancing with the wind. The boys laughed as it soared higher and higher. That night, as they lay in bed, Orville turned to his brother. "Do you think people will ever fly?" he asked. Wilbur stared at the ceiling, thinking. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to find out." Years later, they would remember that moment. The little toy helicopter, the giant kite, the way the wind carried their dreams higher and higher. They didn't know it yet, but their journey had already begun. Chapter 2. Tinkering and Troubles. The Wright brothers were not like other boys. While others played games or went fishing, Wilbur and Orville spent hours tinkering. They took things apart, clocks, toys, even their father's tools, just to see how they worked. Their hands were always busy. Their minds were always thinking. One day, they built a kite. It was small, just a simple frame with cloth stretched over it. But when the wind caught it, it soared. Wilbur and Orville watched with wide eyes. What if they could make something even bigger? What if they could build something that could carry a person? The idea stuck in their minds. But before they could dream too big, they had work to do. They weren't rich. They had to make their own way in the world. So as teenagers, they started a newspaper business. With an old printing press, they printed news for the people of Dayton, Ohio. It was hard work, setting the type, inking the pages, rolling the press, but they loved it. Every day was a challenge. Every mistake was a lesson. Then life changed. Their mother, Susan Wright, became sick. She had always been their biggest supporter. She taught them how to use tools. She encouraged them to be curious. But now, she was too weak to leave her bed. Wilbur spent days by her side, reading to her, holding her hand. Orville tried to stay strong, but inside, he was scared. And then, she was gone. The house felt empty without her. Wilbur became quiet. He stopped playing, stopped laughing. He even stopped making things. Orville felt lost. Their world had changed, and for the first time, they didn't know what to do. But time passed. Slowly, the brothers found their way back to their old habits. Their hands needed to build. Their minds needed to create. They started fixing bicycles, turning it into a small business. Bicycles were everywhere in the 1890s. People needed repairs. The Wright brothers were good at it. And then, an idea. A bicycle is just a machine. It moves. It balances. It stays in the air for a moment when you jump. Wilbur and Orville looked at each other. "If we can balance a bicycle," Wilbur said, "why not a flying machine?" Their excitement returned. The spark was back. But could they really do it? Could two bicycle mechanics figure out something that scientists had failed to solve? The world didn't believe it, but the Wright brothers didn't care. They were ready to try. Chapter 3. From Bicycles to the Sky. The streets of Dayton, Ohio, were filled with bicycles. Men in suits, women in long skirts, even young boys, everyone was riding. Bicycles were fast, exciting, and new. People needed repairs, and the Wright brothers had a plan. Their small bicycle shop became a success. They fixed broken wheels, tightened chains, and sold the best models. Customers trusted them. Wilbur and Orville were not just good mechanics. They were problem solvers. But as they worked, another idea grew in their minds. A bicycle moves forward. A bicycle stays balanced. A bicycle gives freedom. One evening, Wilbur wiped his hands on a cloth and looked at Orville. "If we can balance a bicycle," he said, "why not a flying machine?" Orville stopped, thinking. No one had ever done it before. People had tried. They had built gliders, wings, and giant machines. But they always crashed. Some said flight was impossible. Others believed only birds were meant to fly. The Wright brothers disagreed. At night, they read books about flight. They studied birds, watching how they turned their wings. They experimented with small models, testing ideas. Their bicycle shop became more than a business. It became a workshop for dreams. They built a wind tunnel, a small wooden box with a fan. It helped them test wing shapes. They made tiny wings and watched how the air moved over them. They wrote notes, made calculations, and adjusted their designs. But it wasn't enough. They needed to go bigger. In 1899, Wilbur wrote a letter to the Smithsonian Institution asking for the latest research on flight. Scientists had studied flying machines for years, but none had succeeded. The information was useful, but the Wright brothers had new ideas. They believed control was the key. If they could control a flying machine the way a rider controls a bicycle, they could succeed where others had failed. They built a glider, light, with curved wings. They took it to a field and held their breath. Would it fly? A strong wind blew. Wilbur ran forward, lifting the glider. For a moment, it floated, then fell. Not enough lift, not enough balance. Failure. They tried again and again. Every test taught them something new. They changed the wings. They changed the controls. Slowly, the glider stayed in the air longer. It moved more smoothly. It began to feel right. But a glider wasn't enough. They needed power. They needed an engine. Could two self-taught bicycle mechanics really build an airplane? The world would soon find out. Chapter 4. 1,000 failures, one step closer. The wind howled across the empty sand dunes. Wilbur tightened his scarf and looked at the horizon. Nothing but open land, wild and free, perfect for testing a flying machine. Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, a place far from home, a place where the wind never stopped. The brothers had chosen it carefully. Strong winds, soft sand, ideal conditions for experiments. But nothing about their journey would be easy. The first glider was ready. It had long, curved wings. Wilbur stepped forward, gripping the frame. He took a deep breath, then ran. The wind lifted the glider. It floated for a moment, then twisted. The nose dipped. The wings tilted. And then, crash! The glider lay broken on the sand. Orville ran to his brother. "Are you hurt?" Wilbur brushed the dust from his coat. "I'm fine," he said. But his eyes showed frustration. Failure. Again. They studied the broken pieces. What went wrong? The wings? The balance? The controls? They made notes, drew new designs, and built again. They would not stop. Day after day, they tested. Some flights lasted a few seconds. Others ended in disaster. Wood snapped. Fabric tore. Sand filled their shoes, their mouths, their eyes. The wind was cruel, throwing their machines down like toys. People watched from a distance, shaking their heads. "They're crazy," some whispered. "Men will never fly." But the Wright brothers did not listen. Back in their camp, they built a wind tunnel, a simple wooden box with a fan. Inside, small models spun in the wind. They tested hundreds of wings, thick wings, thin wings, short, long, curved, flat. Which shape was best? Which could cut through the air like a bird? Slowly, they found the answers. The wings needed a curve, but not too much. They needed a shape that lifted, not dragged. Each test, each failure, led them closer to success. Months passed. Their gliders improved. They stayed in the air longer, gliding smoother, turning when Wilbur moved the controls. They were learning the secret of flight. But there was still one problem. Power. Gliders could ride the wind, but they could not fly on their own. The brothers needed an engine, a light one, a strong one. but no company made engines that small. So once again, they built their own. They worked with their mechanic, Charlie Taylor. In their bicycle shop, metal clanged, tools scraped, fire roared. They melted, shaped, and carved. A simple 4-cylinder engine was born, heavy but strong. Finally, it was time. December 1903, cold. The wind cut through their coats. The machine stood ready, the Wright flyer. It was bigger than the gliders, heavier, stronger. The engine sat behind the pilot. 2 wooden propellers spun in the wind. Wilbur and Orville looked at each other. This was it. A deep breath. A silent prayer. Orville climbed into the machine. He gripped the controls. The engine roared to life. The propellers turned. The flyer shook, then moved forward, faster, faster. The nose lifted. For 12 seconds, it flew. Wilbur ran beside it, shouting with joy. The dream was real. The impossible had happened. 1,000 failures, 1,000 broken wings. And now, at last, man had taken flight. Chapter 5. Kitty Hawk, A Place for Dreamers. The wind never stopped in Kitty Hawk. It whistled through the dunes, roared over the hills, and whipped against the brothers' faces as they worked. The sand blew into their eyes, their hair, their food. It was everywhere. But Wilbur and Orville didn't care. They had come for the wind. They had come to fly. Far from home, far from the busy streets of Dayton, they built their camp. A small wooden shack for shelter, another for their tools. Their supplies were simple. Some food, a few blankets, and the most important thing of all, their glider. The machine was beautiful. A strong wooden frame, large curved wings, a control system that they had designed themselves. It was their greatest work yet. But would it fly? Wilbur stepped forward first. He gripped the frame, his heart pounding. The wind rushed past him. He ran, pushing forward, feeling the lift. The glider rose. For a moment, it floated, light as a feather. Then, a sudden shift. The nose dipped, the wings twisted, and then, crash! Orville ran to his brother. "Are you hurt?" Wilbur sat up slowly, brushing sand from his face. "No," he said, but the disappointment in his voice was clear. They pulled the glider from the wreckage. The damage wasn't too bad. But something wasn't right. The wings, the weight, the balance, they needed answers. Day after day, they tested. Each time, the glider lifted a little longer, a little higher, but never quite enough. The sand caught their feet. The wind was unpredictable. The machine fought against them. Locals gathered to watch. Fishermen, farmers, young boys. They whispered among themselves. "These men think they can fly?" Some shook their heads. Others laughed. The Wright brothers ignored them. They studied birds, watching their wings move with the wind. They took notes, measured angles, tested different designs. If birds could do it, so could they. Wilbur sat by the fire one evening, staring at the broken glider. "We're missing something," he murmured. Orville nodded. "We need more control." That night, they sketched a new idea, a way to twist the wings, to turn smoothly, like a bird in flight. It was risky. It had never been done before, but they had to try. The next morning, they built again. The sun rose over the dunes. The wind whistled through the empty land. The new glider stood, waiting. Orville climbed in. He gripped the controls. The wind picked up. Wilbur steadied the glider. "Ready?" Orville nodded. He ran, the wind pushing against him. The glider lifted. It floated, steady, smooth. He twisted the wings, and it turned, not falling, not crashing, flying. Wilbur cheered, running after his brother. The dream was real. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was something, a step closer. They weren't going home, not yet, not until they had conquered the sky. Before we begin Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on WooEnglish. Remember, this content is specially made for WooEnglish listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of WooEnglish's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6. The Moment That Changed the World. The sky was pale and empty. The wind cut through the air, sharp and relentless. The sand beneath their feet was frozen, hard from the night's cold. It was the morning of December 17th, 1903. The day that everything would change. Wilbur and Orville stood beside their machine, their greatest invention, their biggest dream, the Wright Flyer. It looked fragile, its wooden frame and fabric-covered wings trembling in the wind. But this was no ordinary machine. This one was meant to fly. The brothers had worked for years for this moment. Failures, crashes, broken wings, endless nights of planning, all had led them here. They had tested, adjusted, rebuilt, and tried again. But today was different. Today, they had an engine. A real engine. A machine that could lift itself into the air, not just glide, but fly. The wind was strong, almost too strong. But they couldn't wait. They wouldn't wait. They had come too far. Orville stepped forward. His heart pounded. His hands shook as he gripped the controls. Wilbur tightened his coat and leaned in close. "Are you ready?" Orville nodded. He climbed onto the machine, lying flat on his stomach, hands steady on the levers. His breath was short, his mind racing. Wilbur positioned himself beside the flyer, gripping the wing to keep it steady. The machine rumbled, the small engine coming to life. The propellers spun, slicing through the icy air. Everything was ready. Orville reached forward and pulled the lever. The plane moved. Slow at first, then faster. The wooden rails beneath the wheels creaked. The flyer bounced on the rough ground. Wilbur ran alongside, his eyes fixed on the machine, his heart pounding. Would it happen? Would it lift? Or would it fall like all the others? And then the wheels left the ground, just for a second. Then another. The flyer rose. Wilbur's eyes widened. The machine was flying. Orville held the controls tight. The plane wobbled, shaky in the strong wind. He adjusted, turning slightly, feeling the power of the air beneath him. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't high, but it was real. 12 seconds. Then, thud. The flyer hit the sand, skidding to a stop. Silence. Orville sat up slowly, breathless, his face frozen in shock. Wilbur ran toward him, his boots kicking up dust. His eyes were shining. "You did it!" Orville laughed, gasping for air. "We did it!" They turned and looked at the machine, lying still in the sand. It was dented, but not broken. It had worked. They had flown. The impossible was no longer impossible. They took turns. Wilbur went next. Another flight, a little longer. Then Orville again. Then Wilbur. Each time they flew farther, higher. The fourth flight was the longest. 59 seconds, almost a full minute in the air. The wind howled around them, but the flyer held strong. They had done what no one else in history had ever done. Man had taken to the sky. A few locals had gathered in the distance, watching with wide eyes. They didn't laugh this time. They didn't shake their heads. They had seen it with their own eyes. The world would never be the same. The brothers stood side by side, looking at their machine. The wind blew against their faces. Their clothes were covered in sand, their hands stiff from the cold. But they had done it. Wilbur clapped Orville on the back. "We fly, brother!" Orville grinned. "Yes, and this is only the beginning." Chapter 7. Proving the World Wrong. The morning air was crisp. The sky stretched wide, endless and open. The world had changed, but most people didn't know it yet. Wilbur and Orville had done the impossible. They had flown. They had felt the air lift their machine, had controlled it, had landed safely. But when they sent letters to newspapers, to scientists, to experts, no one believed them. A machine heavier than air could not fly. That was what they said. That was what the world believed. The Wright brothers shook their heads. They had the proof. They had seen it, felt it, lived it. But words were not enough. They had to show the world. Back in Dayton, they built a new plane. Better, stronger, faster. The flyer had worked, but it was only the beginning. It was unstable, hard to control, too fragile for long flights. They needed something more. They worked late into the night, measuring, cutting, hammering. The sound of tools filled their small workshop. Wood dust covered their clothes. Ink stained their fingers as they scribbled notes, tested ideas, calculated new designs. Each failure was a lesson. Each test brought them closer. They added a new control system. They improved the engine. They changed the shape of the wings. Little by little, the dream became reality. They returned to Kitty Hawk, this time with confidence. No more doubts, no more guesses. This time, they knew. Wilbur climbed into the cockpit. The wind blew strong. The propellers spun. The engine roared. He pushed forward. The plane lifted. Higher than before. Smoother. More controlled. He turned left, then right. He climbed, then dipped. It was no accident. It was not luck. This was real. He landed softly on the sand, his heart pounding. Orville ran to him, breathless. "It works," Wilbur said. Orville grinned. "Let's do it again." And they did. Again and again. Each flight was longer. Each landing was smoother. There was no doubt anymore. But still, the world refused to listen. They wrote letters. They sent photographs. Scientists ignored them. Reporters laughed. Some called them liars. Others called them fools. It was frustrating, maddening. They had done it. Why wouldn't anyone believe them? But the Wright brothers were not men who gave up. They took their plane to Huffman Prairie, a field near Dayton. There, they would fly where people could see. No more letters, no more explanations, just proof. Crowds gathered, skeptical, curious. Some expected a disaster. Some expected nothing at all. Wilbur climbed in. Orville held his breath. The plane moved forward, faster, smoother than ever before. And then it lifted. Gasps filled the air. The crowd froze. The plane turned, controlled, steady, real. Wilbur flew for 39 minutes. When he landed, the world had changed again. There was no denying it now. The skeptics had seen it with their own eyes. The news spread fast. The age of flight had begun. Newspapers finally printed their story. Scientists came to study their work. Governments became interested. Military officials saw potential. The Wright brothers were no longer just two bicycle mechanics from Ohio. They were aviators. They had proven the world wrong. But this was just the beginning. Chapter 8. Fame, Fortune, and Rivalries. The world finally believed them. Newspapers printed their names in bold letters. Photographs of their flying machines spread across the country. People marveled at the impossible thing these two brothers had done. Kings, presidents, and wealthy businessmen wanted to meet them. Some offered money. Others wanted a demonstration. Wilbur and Orville were no longer just bicycle makers from Dayton. They were pioneers. But success was never simple. At first, they only wanted to fly, to perfect their machine, to make it safer, faster, better. But now there were problems they had never imagined. Other inventors had taken notice. Some wanted to copy their ideas. Others claimed they had discovered flight first. Some said the Wrights were not special at all. The brothers had spent years struggling, testing, failing, and learning. They had built the first controlled, powered aircraft. But now, people wanted to take what they had worked so hard to create. So, they took action. They patented their invention. They wanted to protect their work. They wanted recognition, not just for themselves, but for history. Their machine was different from anything before it. It was not just a glider. It had controls. It could turn, rise, descend. It was the future of flight. But the fight had only begun. Other inventors were angry. They refused to pay for the Wrights' designs. They built their own machines, changing small details, hoping to escape the brothers' patents. Some succeeded. Others failed. Lawsuits followed. Endless battles in court. Arguments, accusations, fights over who had the right to fly. Some called the Wrights greedy. Others said they were trying to control the skies. Wilbur and Orville felt betrayed. They had never wanted fame. They had never sought fortune. They had wanted to solve a mystery, to give humanity a gift. Now they spent more time with lawyers than with engines. And there was another problem. Europe was watching. France, Germany, England, they all wanted flight. Their governments funded experiments. Their scientists worked day and night. They wanted the technology, and they wanted it fast. The Wrights traveled to Europe. They gave demonstrations. In France, Wilbur soared above a cheering crowd. People gasped as he turned smoothly through the air. It was graceful, elegant, something never seen before. The world was finally convinced. Leaders offered them contracts. The U.S. government became interested. The military saw opportunity. Planes could be used for war. It was no longer just about dreams. It was about power. Success had come. But at a cost. Wilbur was exhausted. The battles, the arguments, the endless need to prove themselves, it had drained him. He wanted to work. He wanted to improve their designs. But instead, he was trapped in meetings and courtrooms. In 1912, he fell ill. His health declined quickly. The strong, determined man who had once run beside their plane, laughing in victory, now lay weak in bed. And then he was gone. Orville was alone. For the first time in his life, he had no partner, no one to argue with over wing designs, no one to share ideas, no one to dream with. The dream had survived. Flight was real. The world had changed. But for Orville, everything felt different. Fame had come. Fortune had followed. But in the end, all he wanted was his brother back. Chapter 9. Behind the Invention. Family and Love. The world knew their names. Wilbur and Orville Wright, the men who gave us wings, the inventors who changed history, the brothers who proved that humans could fly. But behind their invention, behind the fame, there was another story. A story of family, of sacrifice, of a life dedicated to a dream. They had never worked alone. Their father, Bishop Milton Wright, had always encouraged them. He was a strong, serious man, but he believed in learning. He filled their house with books, ideas, and endless curiosity. He taught them to ask questions, to think beyond what was possible. When they were boys, he gave them their first flying toy, a small wooden helicopter. It was a simple thing, but it lit a fire inside them, a fire that would never go out. And then there was Catherine. She was more than just a sister. She was their closest friend, their biggest supporter. She was smart, sharp, and determined, just like them. While they built their flying machines, she took care of the family. She managed their home. She kept their business running. She believed in them when no one else did. When Wilbur and Orville traveled to France, Catherine went with them. She stood beside them as they demonstrated their planes. She spoke to kings, presidents, and scientists. She helped them fight for recognition. The world saw two genius inventors, But behind them, there was always Catherine Wright. But what about love? What about marriage? Neither brother ever married. They never had children. They never built families of their own. People wondered why. Some said they were too busy. Others said they were too focused on their work. And maybe that was true. Their dream of flight took everything. Every hour, every thought, every piece of their energy. There was no time for romance, for quiet evenings, for family dinners. Wilbur once said, "I have no time for a wife and an airplane." For him, the choice was clear. But there was another reason. They had each other. They were more than just brothers. They were partners, inventors, best friends. They trusted no one else the way they trusted each other. Their world was filled with blueprints, tools, engines, and dreams of the sky. There was no room for anything else. And then Wilbur was gone. His death in 1912 shattered Orville. He had lost more than a brother. He had lost the only person who truly understood him, the one who had stood beside him through every struggle, every failure, every triumph. Catherine tried to help. She stayed by Orville's side, just as she had always done. But then, years later, something happened, something that Orville never expected. Catherine fell in love. She met a man, a kind, intelligent man. And for the first time in her life, she chose something for herself. She got married. Orville was devastated. He felt abandoned, betrayed. He refused to go to the wedding. He refused to speak to her. The bond that had held their family together for so long was broken. Years passed. The Wright name faded from the headlines. The world moved forward. Planes became bigger, faster, more advanced. Orville watched it all from a distance, but something was missing. One day, Catherine became ill. The news reached Orville. He knew he had to see her. He had to make things right. He arrived at her bedside, took her hand, and whispered, "I'm sorry." She smiled. And then she was gone. Orville lived many more years, but he was never the same. His days of invention were over. His greatest work had already been done. The world remembers the Wright brothers for what they built, but behind the invention, behind the history, there was a family, a father who inspired them, a sister who stood by them, a love that was not romantic, but just as deep. They had given the world wings, but at a cost. Chapter 10. The Final Flight of Wilbur Wright. The wind still called to them. The sky was still endless. The dream of flight had become real. But for Wilbur Wright, the journey was coming to an end. The Wright Company was growing. Governments wanted planes. The military was interested. Businessmen saw opportunities. The world had changed because of two brothers, and now they had to fight to keep their invention from being stolen. Wilbur worked harder than ever. He traveled. He spoke with leaders. He fought legal battles to protect their designs. Day after day, he pushed forward. But something was wrong. He was exhausted. His once bright energy was fading. The long hours, the stress, the constant battles, it was taking a toll. He ignored it at first. There was too much to do. Too many people trying to take credit for their work. Too many contracts. Too many meetings. Then, one morning, he woke up with a fever. It was nothing, he thought, just a cold. He continued working. He still read, still wrote letters, still planned the future, but the fever didn't go away. It got worse. Orville noticed. "You need to rest," he told his brother. Wilbur shook his head. "There's no time." But time was running out. His body grew weaker. His hands, once so strong, trembled. His voice, once full of passion, became faint. He could no longer stand for long. He stayed in bed, staring out the window, watching the world he had changed move on without him. Doctors came. They spoke in hushed voices. Typhoid fever. It was serious. There was little they could do. Orville sat by his brother's side. He brought him water. He read to him. He tried to talk about the future, about new ideas, new flights. But Wilbur's eyes were heavy. "Do you remember?" Orville whispered one night. "That first flight, 12 seconds. Wilbur smiled weakly. "I remember." He closed his eyes. "We flew, Orv." Orville gripped his hand. "Yes, we did." On May 30th, 1912, Wilbur Wright took his final flight. Orville was silent. The newspapers wrote about Wilbur's death, about his achievements, about the man who had changed the world. But none of it mattered to Orville. He had lost more than a brother. He had lost half of himself. For days, he barely spoke. He walked through their workshop, touching the tools, the blueprints, the unfinished work. Everything was as Wilbur had left it. The world was moving forward. But Orville felt frozen in time. People asked, "What will you do now?" He didn't know. For so long, they had been together. Every idea, every test, every moment of triumph and failure, always side by side. Now, the sky felt empty. The wind whispered, but it carried no answers. He could not stop. Wilbur would not have wanted that. So, he continued. He protected their work. He improved their planes. He traveled, met leaders, watched the world embrace flight, But without Wilbur, it felt different. Years passed. Planes became faster, stronger. Other inventors entered the field. The dream the Wright brothers had built was now in the hands of the world. Orville watched, sometimes with pride, sometimes with sadness. He had once said, "More than anything, I wish Wilbur could see this." But Wilbur was gone. Orville never flew again. Chapter 11. Orville's Legacy and the Changing Skies. The world was no longer the same. Orville sat by the window, watching the sky. Airplanes flew overhead, their engines roaring, their wings cutting through the clouds. Some carried passengers across countries. Others were built for war. War. That was something he and Wilbur had never imagined. When they built their first plane, it had been about freedom, about discovery, about proving the impossible. Now planes dropped bombs. They fought battles in the air. Nations used them as weapons. Orville felt a deep sadness. This was not what he and his brother had dreamed of. But it was not all bad. Airplanes had connected the world. People could travel across oceans in hours, not weeks. Letters arrived faster. Medicine, food, and supplies could be flown to places in need. Scientists used planes to study the earth, to explore new places. Flight had changed everything. Orville knew this was bigger than him, bigger than Wilbur. But still, he could not help but wonder. Had they done the right thing? Time passed. New planes were built, faster, stronger, more powerful than ever before. The Wright Flyer was now just a piece of history. Museums displayed it behind glass. People stared at it, amazed by how small and fragile it looked. Orville visited the Smithsonian. He walked slowly, stopping in front of their plane. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of the wings. Memories filled his mind. The cold morning, the roar of the engine, the moment when the wheels left the ground for the first time. His heart ached. Wilbur should have been here to see this. The years went on. Orville became an old man. His hair turned white. His steps became slower. The world around him moved fast, too fast. New technologies, new ideas, new faces. But he had seen it all. He had lived it. One day, a reporter asked him, "Are you proud of what you and Wilbur accomplished?" Orville smiled softly. He thought for a long time before answering. "Yes," he said, "but I miss the days when we were just two boys, dreaming of flying." In 1948, Orville took his final breath. The last of the Wright brothers was gone. But their dream, it would never die. Today, we fly across the world in hours. We send rockets beyond the earth. We explore the skies, the stars, the universe. All because two brothers once stood on a windy beach in Kitty Hawk and refused to give up. Chapter 12. The sky is not the limit. The world is faster now. People step onto airplanes, sit back, and close their eyes. In a few hours, they land in another country, another time zone, another world. Travel that once took months now takes only a day. It is ordinary. It is expected. Few stop to think about how it all began. But it all started with two brothers and a dream. Wilbur and Orville Wright never imagined how far their invention would go. They wanted to fly, to lift off the ground for a few seconds, to prove that a machine heavier than air could stay in the sky. They worked, failed, tried again. They faced doubt, rejection, and exhaustion. But they never stopped. And now, the world moves on wings. Airplanes cross oceans, connecting people and places. Scientists use flight to study the earth, to understand the weather, to save lives. Military pilots train in powerful jets, flying faster than sound. And then, there is space. A plane was only the beginning. Once humans conquered the sky, they looked up, higher, further, beyond. Rockets launched, breaking free from the earth. Satellites circled the planet. Then, one day, a man stepped onto the moon. Orville had lived long enough to see the rise of space travel. He watched as the world celebrated astronauts, as machines soared higher than he and Wilbur had ever dreamed. What would Wilbur have thought? Would he have been amazed? Would he have imagined even more? It was never just about flight. It was about pushing limits. No one thought the Wright brothers would succeed. No one believed two bicycle mechanics could change history. But they did, because they refused to listen to doubt, because they believed in something greater. And that spirit lives on. New generations build faster planes, stronger rockets. They design missions to Mars, to distant planets, to the unknown. The sky was never the limit. It was only the beginning. And it all started on a cold morning in Kitty Hawk, with two brothers and a dream.